They interrupted me 21 times while I was reading my husband's will. The will he wrote with trembling hands before he died. I stayed quiet. I swallowed every sting, every insult, every smirk they thought I couldn't see, but I hit record before the lawyer walked in. And what happened after that changed everything they thought they knew about me. It was the kind of morning that crept in soft and slow, with light filtering through the kitchen window like it had every day for nearly 40 years. The maple trees had just started turning, their leaves warming into golds and reds. Rye would have called it perfect coffee weather. He used to say that as if fall was brewed fresh every morning just for us. I stood by the counter, both hands wrapped around my mug, not for the heat, but for something to hold. The quiet in the house wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that hums around you when something is missing. And for the past 7 months, it had been Ray, my husband, my partner in everything. That morning, I took out the file he left me, a plain cream-colored folder. Inside was the final version of his will. He'd written it by hand, even though we'd drafted it properly with Lena's help months before he passed. But Ray had always been that way, thorough, sentimental, and private. He asked me to read it out loud when the children returned, said he wanted them to hear it from me, said it mattered that they saw my face while I said the words. That part, I think, is what broke me the most because today they were all coming home. Brandon was flying in from Phoenix. Mallory and her husband would drive up from their lakeside condo in Connecticut, and I'd already heard from both of them this week. Not about how I was holding up or if I needed anything. No, just asking about the will. Asking what I planned to do with the land, the house, the accounts. Brandon even sent a draft of something he wanted to review together. Now, I don't know what kind of families other people come from, but I can tell you this. When your son refers to your home as a legacy property in an email, something has shifted. When your daughter suggests repurposing the barn before she's even seen the will, something has snapped. I walked into Ray's old office that morning and placed the folder on the desk. I stared at the chair he used to sit in, the one with the leather so worn it had taken the shape of his shoulders. I could still see the last mug of coffee he left half full beside the lamp. I'd never moved it. The air felt thick, like it knew what was coming. And maybe I did too, because what I needed to read wasn't just words on a page. It was Ray's last attempt to hold this family together, and I didn't know yet if they were ready to hear it. But I was. And I had a quiet thought then, one I didn't dare speak aloud. That maybe, just maybe, Ray had written that letter, knowing they wouldn't really listen. Maybe he left it for me to hear myself say it out loud. So, I'd stopped doubting what I already knew. They weren't coming to honor him. They were coming to claim what they believed they were owed. Mallory arrived first. She pulled into the driveway in a sleek black SUV, the kind with tinted windows and automatic everything. Her husband stayed in the car, scrolling on his phone like he couldn't be bothered. She stepped out, heels clicking on the gravel like she was walking into a conference room. Her coat was sharp, cinched at the waist, hair perfect, smile polite. She didn't look around the porch, didn't notice the ivy Ray and I had planted years ago, climbing higher than the windows now. She came straight inside, called out my name like she was asking for a hotel concierge. I heard her setting down her bag, opening the fridge without hesitation. Then Brandon came 3 hours late. No apology. Just a quick grunt and a long sigh as he kicked off his boots like he lived there. He smelled like airport whiskey and something synthetic. The first thing he asked was if I had Wi-Fi. Not how I was doing. Not if the house felt different without Ray. Just the Wi-Fi. They settled around the kitchen table like they were here for business. Mallory opened her tablet. Brandon dropped a folder beside his coffee mug. They started showing me mock-ups, logos, budget lines. A PowerPoint presentation about transforming the barn into an event space and turning the upper acres into luxury tiny homes. They called it the Dunning Revival Project. Not once did they say our family name like it meant something to them. To them, it was a brand. Brandon explained their plan like it was already in motion. Zoning options investors. He said we needed to move quickly before the market changed. Mallory chimed in with projections. She said wellness retreats were trending. She used words like potential and equity. Her tone stayed light, her words sugary, but her eyes watched me closely like she was waiting for a yes. They weren't asking for permission. They were managing me, framing it all as if they were doing me a favor. Brandon said it was the smart move. He said it would free me from the burden of managing an old house and acres of unused land. He said it would finally let me relax as if I hadn't already been living in peace until they decided to turn grief into a business plan. When I asked about Ray's will, they glanced at each other. Mallory said they hadn't seen the final copy, but they assumed he wanted what was best for the family. Brandon laughed and said, "Dad never liked wasting opportunities." Then he changed the subject, pulled out another document for me to look over. It was a draft agreement for my signature. A transfer of partial ownership, 60% to them. I didn't speak. I just looked at the paper. My name typed out in bold, a dotted line waiting at the bottom. They kept talking. Background music from their world of numbers and control. I got up, walked into the next room, and closed the door behind me. For a long moment, I didn't move. Just stood there, hand on the frame, heart steady, not angry, not afraid, just clear. I finally saw it. This wasn't about Ray. It wasn't even about family. It was about leverage. And they believed they had it. They believed I would fold like an old chair at the edge of a yard sale. But they had no idea what was still folded inside me. The next morning, the living room was already staged. Brandon had pushed the coffee table aside and placed 3 chairs in a semicircle like it was some kind of boardroom. Mallory lit a cinnamon candle. She said it would make the space feel warm. All it did was remind me of how much they wanted control over the atmosphere, even the scent. I brought down the envelope. The original copy of Ray's will was inside, folded once, creased at the top. He'd signed it himself 3 days before he was admitted to hospice. His handwriting had wavered near the end, but the message was clear. He wanted everything shared equally. He wanted me to read it aloud in front of them. No attorneys, no arguments, just us. I stood while they sat. The pages trembled in my hands, but not because I was unsure. It was the weight of what came next. I opened my mouth to begin. Brandon cut in. He asked if I had reviewed the zoning document from yesterday. I told him I would prefer we stick to the will first. He nodded, but Mallory jumped in before I could speak another word. She said it would be helpful to hear what Dad's wishes were, but also added that any decisions should be viewed through a financial lens. She mentioned responsible stewardship. I continued reading. By the time I reached the 3rd paragraph, Brandon interrupted again, this time to ask if Ray had really written it alone or if Lena had influenced the phrasing. I told him Lena had only helped format the earlier versions. This one was entirely Ray's. He leaned back and muttered something under his breath. I kept reading. Mallory stopped me next, wanting to clarify the term irrevocable trust mentioned near the end. I told her we would get to that part soon. She smiled and said she just wanted to make sure there were no misunderstandings. I started again and they kept going. They asked about property taxes, legacy planning, the logistics of restructuring the accounts. They asked if the document had been notarized. They asked if I had made any edits. They questioned dates, signatures, word choice. They interrupted me 21 times. I counted, not out loud, not on paper, but inside. I marked each one like notches on a fence post. Each moment chipped away at the silence Ray had hoped for. Each interruption erased what could have been a moment of shared memory. They weren't listening to the words. They were listening for opportunities. By the time I reached the final sentence, I realized something. They had no intention of honoring it. This wasn't about understanding his wishes. It was about rooting them. Rewriting them by making so much noise that the meaning got lost in the clutter. I looked at their faces. Brandon was tapping his pen against the arm of his chair. Mallory was scrolling on her phone. I folded the will quietly and placed it back in the envelope. Told them we were done for now, that the lawyer would be here the following afternoon. Mallory nodded, said that was for the best. Brandon asked if we could revisit the equity breakdown later, said he had a few refinements in mind. I didn't answer. I walked upstairs and sat at the edge of the bed, the same one Ray had rested on for the last week of his life. My hands were still, my breathing even. There was no anger left, only clarity. They had made a mistake. They thought they were wearing me down, but they were only helping me see them more clearly, helping me remember who I was before the grief, before the quiet, before they turned my home into a conference call. And they had no idea I'd just begun to listen. Really listen to them, to Ray, to myself. That night, I went to the hall closet and pulled out the old voice recorder Ry used to keep. It still had the same scuff mark on the corner from where it had once fallen off his desk. I checked the batteries, still working. It had been years since I touched it, but my fingers knew exactly what to do. Quietly, I slipped it into my cardigan pocket and left it there. The next morning, I made pancakes, not because I wanted to, but because feeding people was something I could control. Mallory barely touched hers. She was already reviewing emails by the time the syrup hit the table. Brandon ate like he hadn't had a meal in 2 days. No one asked if I had slept. No one said anything about yesterday. It was as if the reading of Ray's will had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience in their schedule. At 9:56, the lawyer arrived. Her name was Dina Marone. She had a calm face, the kind that didn't react much. I liked her immediately. She greeted Brandon and Mallory with polite distance, then shook my hand with both of hers. I led her to the dining room. I had already set the recorder under a napkin next to my chair. Dina opened her briefcase. She started by stating that Ray's most recent will had been notarized, filed, and confirmed legally binding. She explained what an irrevocable trust meant carefully. She did not speak down to me, and she didn't let Brandon interrupt, but he tried twice. Mallory chimed in once with a question about flexibility. Dina answered it simply. No, that was the nature of an irrevocable trust. The allocations could not be modified without serious legal grounds, which they did not have. I watched Brandon's jaw tighten. Mallory crossed her arms. Dina continued. Ry had left specific instructions. The house would remain in my name. The land was to be split equally among the 3 children, including my late daughter's share, which was designated to her son, Thomas. A financial advisor had been appointed to manage distribution until Thomas turned 25. Ray had also requested a memorial scholarship be established in his name at the local high school. I had known about the scholarship, but I didn't know Ray had already begun funding it through his life insurance. That part caught me off guard. It made my chest tighten in a strange way. Love and sadness mixed like wet paint. Brandon leaned forward and asked Dina if the property assets could be consolidated into a family LLC instead. He said it would be more efficient. Dina repeated herself. The will was final. Brandon asked if I had been influenced, if maybe I didn't understand all the legal language at the time of signing. Dina looked at me, then looked back at him. She told him the will wasn't mine. It was Ray's. Mallory took out a printout. It was a list of ideas, events, branding, concepts. She asked if the trust could potentially be used to fund early-stage renovations on the barn. Dina told her no, not unless the other beneficiaries agreed, which included Thomas's guardian and the trustee. Mallory's smile slipped. Brandon didn't speak for a while. When he did, his voice was tight. He said he just wanted what was best for the family. I said nothing. After Dina left, I walked her out and thanked her. She paused by the car, told me she'd handled hundreds of family estates, and that what I was doing took courage. I nodded, held her gaze, and said I wasn't done yet because I wasn't. That recorder in my pocket held the proof of how little respect they had for Ray's final words, and I had no intention of letting it go to waste. That night, I sat in Ray's office and played the recording back. I listened to every interruption, every deflection, every time they turned something meant to honor him into a business pitch. Their voices were calm, composed, even cheerful at moments. But underneath it all was entitlement, quiet, calculated entitlement. I labeled the file and saved it onto a flash drive. Then I backed it up to my email. I did it slowly, intentionally, because I had learned something important in the silence that followed Ray's passing. Protecting your peace means preparing for when others try to take it. The next morning, I made phone calls first to Lena, then to the accountant Rai had trusted for 20 years, then to the trustee named in the will. His name was Marcus Clinet, and he remembered Rai well. I told him what had been said during the meeting with Dina. I told him I had a recording. He asked me to send it. I did. By noon, I had arranged to meet with Marcus at his office the following week. He told me he would begin preparing a summary report of the legal standing of the estate, and that he would also make a formal note of any coercive behavior or attempts to undermine the trust. He said those things mattered, especially when money was involved. Brandon and Mallory didn't ask where I was going. They assumed I was running errands. They assumed a lot of things like that. I was fragile, that grief had made me slow, that silence meant weakness. But they didn't know I was writing everything down. They didn't know I had kept copies of every draft Ray ever wrote. They didn't know I had the first version of the will where Ray had left everything to me outright before I convinced him to include the others. They didn't know how many decisions Ray had deferred to me because he trusted my judgment more than their ambition. That afternoon, Brandon invited a local contractor over without telling me. I came in from watering the porch plants and saw him walking the man through the sidey yard, pointing to the barn and nodding as if he already owned it. When I asked what was going on, he said they were just gathering estimates, said it would be useful down the line. I told him to cancel it. He said I was being difficult. I said the discussion was over. Mallory stayed out of it. She sat at the kitchen island sipping her tea, watching us like she was measuring the air. Later that night, I found a folder left open on the dining table. Inside was a mock budget breakdown, construction, marketing, web design, a line item labeled Transitional Oversight. I saw my name next to it in parentheses. Mallory had typed initial soft roll, later phased out. It was there plain as daylight. They had no intention of keeping me involved, no intention of honoring what Rai built. They were only being polite because the house was still in my name, because the trust was still out of their reach for now. I didn't say anything. I closed the folder and placed it back exactly where I found it. But I started packing the next day, not because I was leaving, but because I was preparing to move everything that mattered somewhere safer, somewhere they couldn't touch. By the time they realized what I was doing, it would already be done. And all their blueprints, all their backdoor plans, all their smug confidence would collapse under the weight of one truth they had refused to believe: that I was still Ray's wife, still his partner, and I was not done protecting what we built. 2 days later, I called Thomas's guardian, Maria. She was Ray's cousin on his mother's side, and she had been caring for Thomas ever since we lost Emily. Maria was kind but sharp, the kind of woman who didn't waste time with polite nonsense. I told her about the meeting, about the interruptions, about Brandon and Maller's attempt to rework the estate into a business model with themselves at the center. I didn't dramatize anything. I just sent her the recording and let her hear it herself. Within 24 hours, Maria called me back. She had already spoken to Marcus, the trustee. She told me she would file a formal objection to any proposed restructuring of assets unless it directly benefited Thomas. She also made it clear she would not tolerate any pressure or manipulation toward me. I thanked her. She said it wasn't about me. It was about Ray, about respect. That same afternoon, Marcus called to confirm that he had documented everything. He had begun drafting a letter of advisory to the other 2 beneficiaries, stating that any further attempt to interfere with the structure of the trust without consensus could result in legal action. His tone was dry, professional, but underneath it, I could hear something else. He had seen this kind of behavior before. I asked him if I should say anything to Brandon and Mallory. He said I didn't need to. The documentation would speak for itself. Still, I knew I had to prepare for what came next. They weren't going to let this go quietly. That night, I went through Ray's old files. I pulled out the original plans for the orchard, the loan paperwork from the year we nearly lost the house, the notes he'd taken during his final months. Ray had recorded everything, not because he didn't trust people, but because he had learned that memories fade and promises slip. Paper stayed. Paper told the truth. I found a small folder tucked behind a box of tax returns. Inside were hand-drawn sketches for a community garden, notes about veterans in the area, ideas for mentorship programs. He'd written a line in pencil, barely legible. Let them build something that lasts. It wasn't underlined. It wasn't explained. But I understood. Ray hadn't just wanted to leave money. He had wanted to leave direction, vision, a reason for the land to remain whole. The next morning, I scheduled a call with a local nonprofit. I told them I had a potential proposal pending some legal clarity. They were interested. They had been trying to expand into rural programs for years. I didn't tell Brandon or Mallory anything, but I saw Mallory watching me from the window that afternoon as I spoke on the phone by the garden. She was narrowing her eyes, reading my body language. I pretended not to notice. She stepped back behind the curtain. Later, I found the barn door open. Just a few inches. Nothing broken, nothing stolen, just open. I shut it quietly and I locked it. Whatever they thought they were getting away with, whatever plans they thought they could push through behind my back, they were about to learn something Ray always understood. I may have been quiet, but I was never passive, and they had mistaken patience for permission. The next morning, I woke early. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock above the mantel. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around the warm mug, watching the light shift across the floor. I had barely taken my second sip when Mallory walked in, fully dressed, phone in hand. Her eyes didn't meet mine. She was already speaking before she reached the table. She said they had scheduled a second meeting with the contractor, said they needed more accurate estimates. I told her the answer was still no, that until everything was finalized and legally settled, no one would be stepping foot on the property with a clipboard. She didn't argue. She just nodded slowly like she was indulging me. Then she left the room. I went upstairs and opened the drawer where I kept copies of the correspondence with Marcus and Maria. Printed everything. Paperwork didn't blink. It didn't shift tone. It stayed where you left it. I placed the documents into a binder and kept it with me, always within reach. Around noon, Brandon returned from town with 2 bottles of wine and a new pressure washer. He said he wanted to start cleaning the front porch, get a jump on the upkeep. I told him not to touch anything. He smiled without humor and asked if I was planning to let the place fall apart just to make a point. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. That evening, the first email arrived. It was from a company I didn't recognize, confirming receipt of an application for property valuation. The sender name had Mallory's initials embedded in it. 15 minutes later, a second email came through. This one from a local architect referencing an upcoming call regarding project specs. Both had been copied to an email thread I had never seen before. They weren't waiting for permission. They were moving forward behind closed doors. I forwarded the emails to Marcus with a note. No approval given. No authorization provided. He replied within the hour. He said he would flag it and begin documentation immediately. Any unauthorized planning, especially if it involved estate assets or property changes, would violate the terms of the trust. I went to the shed after dark. I collected Ray's old blueprints, the ones for the garden, the workshop, the veteran's space. I brought them inside and laid them out on the dining table. I began organizing them into folders, creating a preliminary proposal. I had no intention of letting Brandon and Mallory turn everything into a hollow profit engine. If Ray's land was going to be used, it would serve people, real people, not investors, not trend followers. I stayed up until midnight working through the documents. The next morning, I submitted a preliminary outline to the nonprofit team I had spoken with earlier. They responded enthusiastically. They said the direction aligned perfectly with their mission. They asked if I could meet their board next week. I agreed. That afternoon, Brandon knocked on my door. For once, he didn't come in. Just stood in the hallway, said he needed to talk. His voice was tight, edges fraying. I told him I was busy. He didn't push. But as he turned to leave, I caught something in his eyes. Not anger, not arrogance, something sharper, a flicker of calculation. He was starting to realize the tide had shifted, and he didn't know where the current would take him. But I did, because I was the one steering now, quietly, steadily, without ever raising my voice. It was the day of the dinner, the one Brandon insisted on calling a transition supper. He printed out little name cards, folded them neatly, and placed them around the table like we were hosting some formal affair. Mallory brought in catered dishes, set out cloth napkins, and lit tapered candles like we were celebrating a merger instead of remembering a man. I wore a soft gray blouse Ray had once complimented. I combed my hair back and put on the earrings he gave me on our 35th anniversary. I moved slowly, intentionally. My heart was steady. By 6 o'clock, the house had filled with the sound of plates and wine glasses. Brandon stood at the head of the table, glass in hand, and gave a short toast. He thanked everyone for coming and said how proud he was that the family was moving forward. Mallory smiled. She reached over and squeezed his hand like they had just sealed something. I waited. After the first course, Brandon leaned back and cleared his throat. He said it was the right time to start talking about next steps. He glanced at Mallory. She nodded and took out a folder. Inside were typed notes and a new draft of a business plan. She handed one to me and began speaking softly as if to a child. She described the vision for converting the orchard into an event space, weekend weddings, local retreats, midweek workshops. She pointed to revenue projections, tax benefits, future scalability. I let her finish. Then I stood up. I said I appreciated their energy, their initiative, their ideas, but that the land was no longer part of any business plan. That as of that morning, ownership of the orchard, the barn, and the adjacent lot had been transferred to the nonprofit I had been working with. That it would be designated for educational and community development purposes. Per Ray's original sketches and legacy notes. Brandon froze. Mallory blinked once, then twice, and asked what that meant for them. I told them the trust remained unchanged. Their shares were intact, but the physical property, the part they had been circling like vultures, was no longer accessible for commercial use. It was now protected under a different mission, a public one they could not manipulate. Mallory's mouth tightened. She said something about needing legal review. I nodded. I said, Marcus already had the documentation. So did Maria. So did the nonprofit's council. Brandon's voice broke through. He said I had no right, that I was dismantling everything Dad worked for. I looked straight at him and said this was exactly what Ray worked for, to leave something that lasted beyond profit, to make something meaningful. I sat down again. The room was silent, the kind of silence that follows the crumbling of something hollow. No one reached for dessert. No one raised a glass. Eventually, Mallory began gathering her papers. Brandon stood slowly, stiff and quiet. They left the dining room without another word. I sat alone for a while after they left. The candles burned low, the food cooled, the wine remained untouched. But I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Relief. Not because it was over, but because I had spoken Ray's truth aloud without hesitation, without apology. I had said the thing he could no longer say himself. And in that moment, I knew I had finally done right by him. The next morning, the house was silent. No footsteps. Oh, no hushed phone calls. No sound of Brandon pacing or Mallory typing at the kitchen island. They had packed up and left sometime in the night. I found a note on the counter. It said they needed space, that things had clearly shifted beyond repair. There was no apology, no signature, just a few vague words and a quiet exit. I stood at the window with my coffee and watched the driveway for a long time, even though I already knew they were gone. There was no satisfaction in their absence, only stillness, a hollow space where confrontation had once filled the air. Later that morning, Marcus called. He had spoken to Mallory's attorney. They had reviewed the property transfer and confirmed it was airtight. The nonprofit partnership was secure. Ray's legacy could proceed without obstruction. Marcus told me he would be forwarding the next quarterly trust report and that I could expect a review meeting next month. His voice was steady, reassuring. After we hung up, I went out to the orchard. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the damp soil. The wind carried the soft scent of early blooms. I walked slowly between the rows, remembering how Ray used to tap the branches, nod to himself, and mumble about pruning schedules. I stood still and let the air settle around me. This was what he meant to protect, not just land, not just fruit, but the quiet dignity of something tended with care. That afternoon, I met with the team from the nonprofit. We sat around the kitchen table, the same one Brandon had once spread business plans across. I served coffee and passed out Ray's old drawings. They listened carefully. They asked thoughtful questions. When I told them Ray's intention was to serve the community, not sell to it, they nodded. One of them, a soft-spoken woman named Clarice, said she had lost her father to cancer last year. She understood the need to do something that mattered after grief. By the time they left, we had agreed on a 6-month pilot program. Local volunteers would maintain the orchard while youth apprentices learned agricultural basics. The barn would serve as a workshop space, offering quiet classes and mentoring for teens who didn't quite fit in at school. It was small, modest, but it was a beginning, and it was his. That evening, I found one of Ray's jackets still hanging on the back porch hook. I slipped my hand into the pocket and found a folded receipt from 2 years ago. It was for 3 apple trees and a shovel. I smiled. He had never stopped planting, even near the end. I sat on the back steps as the sun dropped low, casting golden light across the field. A few birds settled in the trees. The porch creaked gently under my feet. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clear. Like something had been set back in place, not fixed, not erased, just corrected. Sometimes justice doesn't shout, it whispers. And in that quiet, I finally heard Ray again. Not in words, but in what he left behind. Not just the orchard, not just the trust, but the trust in me. That I would finish what he started, that I would remember what mattered, that I would make something grow. The first volunteer group arrived on a Friday morning. A dozen teenagers from the high school 2 towns over, led by a counselor named Devin. They wore secondhand boots and jackets too big for them, but their eyes were bright, curious. Some tried to act indifferent, but I saw the way their hands hovered near the tools, eager but unsure. I gave them a slow tour of the orchard, showed them where Rye had built the irrigation trench, pointed to the compost bins he insisted on placing just behind the hedgerow, told them which trees were planted first, and which ones had always struggled with sun. They listened, not always attentively, but they stayed close. That was enough. Clarice from the nonprofit had arranged for a local artist to paint a mural on the side of the barn. Not a bright cartoon, but something rooted in the land. Rolling hills, open sky, a silhouette of a man planting a tree. Underneath, in small lettering, it read, "Planted with Purpose." She said they wanted the image to grow with the orchard to give it a sense of memory. By mid-afternoon, the kids were laughing, pulling weeds, stacking tools, brushing dust off their sleeves. One of them asked if we would be doing this every week. I said yes. His face broke into a shy grin and he nodded. Later that day, as I was refilling the water jugs, I noticed Mella Larry's car in the distance, parked just past the county line where the road bent near the pasture. She didn't get out, just sat there for a few minutes, engine running. I didn't wave, I didn't move. Eventually, the car turned and drove away. That night, I wrote Ry a letter. I hadn't done that since the week after his service. I told him what we had done about the kids, the mural, the soil that felt looser now, like it was breathing again. I told him I was tired, but in a good way. A different kind of tired than grief, a peaceful kind. I placed the letter inside the old cigar box he kept on his desk, the one filled with small things he never threw away. Ticket stubs, a dried leaf from our first road trip, a tiny key to a toolbox we lost long ago. In the kitchen, I found the notebook I had used to draft meals for the week. I flipped to a new page and wrote a list. Not groceries, not errands, just names. People I wanted to thank. People who had shown up quietly, steadily. People who reminded me that legacy isn't just about money or land. It's about the shape of what we leave behind in others. Ray once told me the orchard would outlive us. That it would bend with time, lose a few limbs, gain a few rings, but if it was cared for, it would endure. Now I understood what he meant, and I was finally ready to let it speak for itself. No more defending it, just letting it grow. Spring came early that year. The orchard bloomed in quiet waves. First the dogwoods, then the apples, then the wild lavender Ray planted near the fence line. Everything softened, even the air. It smelled like a beginning. I spent most mornings outside now. Not working, just watching. The kids from the program came twice a week. Some were the same, others rotated in. They called me Mr. Estelle. One of them, a tall boy named Andre, asked if he could help build new benches near the East Row. Said his grandfather used to work with wood. I said yes. We didn't speak much while we worked, but the silence was good. It was shared, not heavy. One afternoon, Clarice stopped by to drop off some papers. She stood near the edge of the field, hands in her coat pockets, and said the board had approved full partnership status for the orchard. It was official now, protected, named, recognized. I nodded. I didn't need a ceremony, but I did place one of Ray's old caps on the bench we built, right at the center, facing west. That was where the light always fell best. The house felt lighter now, too. Not emptier, just clearer, like everything unnecessary had finally been cleared away. I donated old furniture, sent a box of books to the local library, kept only what mattered. One evening, I stood at the kitchen window and watched the trees. The wind moved through them like a breath. I closed my eyes and let the sound settle. I didn't win anything. I didn't get revenge. But I kept my word to Ray, to myself, to the land. And that more than anything was enough. If this story touched something in you, take a moment. Breathe. Maybe you've had to protect something that no one else saw the value in. Maybe you felt that quiet ache of being dismissed. You're not alone. Share your story or just sit with mine.